firstly, welcome to our webinar on ag permitted development rights. And thank you very much to everybody for joining us. We're a team. The Rural Planning Co is a team of planning consultants, and we specialise in strategic solutions for the agricultural and rural sectors. So this is very important area for us and our team. We cover agricultural, residential, rural business and equestrian planning. And I am Nicola Palmer and I'm the marketing manager for the business. We are based in Ombersley in Worcestershire. We recently moved to some new offices from a farm in Hartlebury, so only just down the road, and we cover planning projects across England. So we do really work as far as Kent, Warwickshire, Oxfordshire, Worcestershire, Herefordshire, all over England. And if you'd like to know more information about that, please do visit our website and you'll find here lots of resources, including case studies and project approvals. So if you want to see what we do, the website is a great place to start. So today, what are we going to do today? We're going to cover permitted development rights. This is going to be PD rights as they apply in England only. We solely work in England. And in the UK, the planning system controls principally two things. So the first is operational development, so physical works, and the second is how land and buildings are used. So most type of developments are either operational development or change of use. And these require planning consent. However, contained within the Town and Country Planning Act, there is something called the General Permitted Development Order, also known as the GDPO. And this sets out a whole raft of building works and uses, which can be done without the need to apply for full planning permission, so long as specific criteria are met. And this is what we refer to as permitted development or PD rights. So this isn't saying that you don't need planning permission, it's the government saying that you already have it in certain circumstances. So in many cases, you still have to give your local authority what is called prior notification. So that is telling them that you intend to exercise or use your PD rights. And this varies by the PD right, and the planners will explain which ones you need to and which ones you don't. So the prior notification system can still feel like a planning application, and there's still a process to go through, and it can still be a bit laborious at times. But there are many advantages of PD, which we will cover during this webinar. And as a business, we certainly recommend using them wherever you can, and they can be a really good way of growing your business successfully. Again, we always say that the most important thing from the outset is to look at the strategy, the planning strategy that you're going to use. And this could well include full planning or permitted development rights planning. So what I'm going to do, without further ado, we're going to move now to Angela Cantrell. So we've got three of our planning consultants joining us today. We've got Angela Cantrell, Sally Moore and Hannah Mole, and they're going to cover the permitted development rights. So Angela's going to start with the agricultural PD rights, then Sally's going to go on to commercial, and Hannah's going to talk about residential. And after that, we'll have hopefully a good 20 minutes for a Q&A session. We've got some questions, but please do pop some questions up on the chat and we can get to them at the end of the presentations. So I'm going to pass over to Angela now.
Okay, everyone. Can everyone see that?
Yes, perfect.
Yes, thank you. So, morning, everyone. I'm Angela. I'm a senior planning consultant. I get involved in agricultural permitted development, or AgPD, as you might hear me refer to it as well as getting involved in equestrian rural businesses and helping them with their projects. So I'm talking about agricultural permitted development today under Part 6, Class A of the General Permitted Development Order. Agricultural PD is available to holdings over 5 hectares, and some rights do exist for other holdings under 5 hectares, but I'm focusing on those holdings over 5 hectares today. So for permitted development, development to be permitted development, it must be reasonably necessary for the purposes of agriculture within that unit, and that's a really crucial and key part of this process. It's essential that there is an existing trade or business and not a new enterprise. It doesn't have to be overly large or profitable business, but it does need to be existing. The farm can comprise of both owned and rented land, and it's essential that an application demonstrates the justification to the council in relation to scale and the nature of the farming activity and land available, as well, coupled with size and design. Increasingly, we're seeing councils using external agricultural consultants to look at these applications. So we recommend that you submit an application which is robust enough to withstand the scrutiny of the council. So before we get into the rules side of things, I just wanted to give you a quick overview of what how you can use permitted development rights. So under agricultural PD, you can actually do quite a range of things without needing full planning permission. You're not just talking about buildings. Yes, you can construct buildings for things like, but you can also do things like concrete yards, tracks, hardstanding, water infrastructure like irrigation pools and drainage, all the things you just need to make your holding function. So it's a really flexible tool. So moving on to the first section, buildings. In terms of scale, you can build up to 1,500 square metres every 2 years under PD, or if it's for livestock, it's 1,000 square metres. So the allowances are pretty generous if they're used properly. Do just bear in mind that there could be limitations where you wanted to extend a building under PD, then the entire building would come under that area calculation. So that just needs to be considered. If the tracks are for livestock or vehicular use, then this is limited to 1,000 square metres. But if, for instance, the hardstanding is for bale storage, then it is usually 1,500 square metres. So there are a few key restrictions just to bear in mind with agricultural PD. You can't use the building for livestock if it's within 400 metres of a protected dwelling. A protected dwelling is another farm or another holding or residences within that farm. Otherwise, it will need full planning permission. This also applies if the building or facility is used for biomass or AD. You can't use PD if you've done, say, Class Q within the previous 10 years. The building can be up to 12 metres in height, but if it's within 3 kilometres of an aerodrome, the building needs to be less than 3 metres in height. It needs to be more than 25 metres away from a road, and the area is calculated on the same unit and cumulatively, and if the building has been provided within the last 2 years and within 90 metres of the new PD, then you just need to consider what's been built recently and take floor areas into account. Something which is useful to know is that livestock can be accommodated in a general purpose building, which isn't technically for the purpose of livestock in the case of emergency or quarantine situations where other buildings aren't available, for instance. If we just move on to talking about tracks. So tracks can be created within the holding, within the unit. These can connect to a road or create an entrance off a road, so long as that road is unclassified. Otherwise, the track just needs to be 25 metres from that classified road. And it's important to note that 60% of roads are unclassified in the UK. So it's important just to double check the local highways authority information on highways, or a really useful website is findmystreet.gov.uk. roads.co.uk, and this can give you information on whether a road is classified or not. Internal tracks are PD, and generally a 1,000 square metre limit generally applies. Just moving on to hard standing and concrete. If you're providing this around a building, the 1,000 square metre limit applies if it's for use for accommodating livestock or plant or machinery. So moving on to muck and slurry storage. Again, PD for this needs to be sited further than 400 metres away from a protected dwelling, and tanks are considered a building, so this will also come within the 1,000 square metre limit. It's likely that soil testing will be needed here with some detailed drawings just to show the council how it will be constructed. And also other regulations might come into play here, and it's just to be aware of what else, what other regulations need to be considered going forward. In terms of irrigation pools, there's no particular limit, but it's important to note here that you can't import waste material, but you can use clay to construct them and line them. So the first thing to say is that for a holding to benefit from PD right, or the site to benefit from a PD right, the works must not have started. If they started, and that might be digging out the base for a building, for instance, PD rights won't be available to you. The council must respond within 28 days, and they take into account siting, design and external appearance. If there's no response within this time, you can assume that prior approval isn't required. However, there are some caveats to that. So it's just important to think carefully before starting work and make sure that everything is in accordance with the plans, for instance. So importantly, PD has to be reasonably necessary for the purposes of agriculture in that unit. And this is usually where schemes succeed or fail. It's not just about what you want to build, it's really about being able to justify it. As you can see with the criteria, there really is some black and white rules here when looking at PD to help you, like the distance of from roads or from protected dwellings. But that last point, the fact that it needs to be reasonably necessary, is really critical. The council's approach to assessing these applications can sometimes be a grey area, and we tend to try and work to help the council to see why it's needed and why it's not just a want. A big part of what we do is helping landowners and rural businesses just work out what's achievable in the first place, and then we try and structure projects so that they meet all the tests and get through the planning system. So as a very brief example, we've seen cases where things look perfectly fine on paper, but the justification isn't just quite there. One project we had in particular where a client was trying to get a consent for a general hay and a storage building under PD. They'd applied for it twice before engaging us. Both applications were unfortunately refused. The issue really wasn't what they were trying to do. It was just the building was really quite modest. The application, it was just the way that the applications had been put together. So really, you know, the justification had been done a bit on the back of a fag packet without much thought or justification. When we came on board for the third attempt, we didn't radically change the proposal. We just approached it a bit differently and properly. We made sure that there was enough information to show the council that the building was reasonably necessary for agriculture within that unit, but without overdoing it or complicating it. And really that's the key. It's about getting that balance right. And ultimately the process is designed to be a light touch. and to save you time and money, not to cost you more by having to submit multiple applications. So really, to sum it up, agricultural planning is really one of the most straightforward routes to gaining consent for structures through the planning system. It's so useful when there's other restrictions in play, like the AONB or National Landscape, and also any sites within the Greenbelt. Often we use it as a PD as a starting point, because once you've established a lawful agricultural building or other works on site, this can really open up other opportunities down the line. So the real takeaway here is that agricultural PD isn't just about building or laying concrete. It's really about strategy and a strategic first step, just ensuring that it caters for both immediate needs on the farm and also for future flexibility. So I hope that gives you a good overview, and if you have any questions, I'm sure Nicola will field them.
Brilliant, thanks Nicola, and thanks Angela. That was a really useful run through of how you can use permitted development to maximise out the agricultural development on your farm. So I'm going to talk through what happens next. If you've got everything that you could justify for agricultural purposes, how can you use permitted development rights to start looking at non-agricultural uses or introduce some farm diversification activities? Starting off with buildings. Class R, is for the change of use of an agricultural building to a commercial use. And this is a really, really useful mechanism on your farm. So say you've got an old grain store or even an old Dutch barn that's effectively just a roof on legs, that could come into this. There's quite a wide range of uses which are permitted under this right, under Class R. And it's not just limited to the traditional kind of storage units on farm that you might expect a farm building to be suitable for. The storage and distribution does come into it, but so does hotels even, and the definition of what's hotel versus a holiday let is something that can be quite interesting in relation to farm buildings. But Class E, which is commercial and business uses, is another really quite interesting one. So Class E can include things like cafes, offices, gyms. This can be tennis courts, paddle courts, all sorts of things like that. It doesn't apply to swimming pools or shooting ranges or things like that, but there is quite a broad range of what you can do under Class E. And you can also look at some elements of wider commercial uses, such as farm processing. Examples of things like this we've done before is processing oilseed rape for rapeseed oil. It doesn't apply to processing livestock projects, so you can't look at creating a sausage factory just yet through this, but there is quite a range of opportunities. Agricultural training comes into it as well. Now, a key point is that it's Class R relates only to the use. So two sides to that. One is that if any building operations are needed, then you have to apply separately for it. But the flip side of that is that there's no test applied to whether the building is particularly suitable for this use. It's just, is there a building? Can we change the use? And then kind of practicalities of how that can be developed can come into it later. So a few criteria to look at with it. You can have up to 1,000 square meters under Class R within your planning unit. That's a huge amount. It's something like 3 tennis courts or something like that. So you can get quite a lot of floor space within that. The building must have been in agricultural use only for the last 10 years, and the building has to have been in place for the last 10 years as well. So that's quite important. If you've kind of had some low-key non-agricultural use, we've got to make sure there's no evidence of that within an application. It can't be a listed building, scheduled monument, or within a safety hazard area, but it's not affected by whether you're in a national park or a national landscape conservation area or something like that. So it's available in areas where some other PD rights aren't available. So I've already mentioned that building works need a separate application, but actually if your proposed building is less, or your proposed use is less than 150 square meters, then you don't even need permission from the council. You do have to notify them, but you don't have to wait for them to respond. If it's more than 150 square meters, then you do have to apply for prior approval, which is through a 56-day notice process. But despite all of that, it's still a really useful process to change the use of your building in a location where full permission just might not be forthcoming, or maybe your council's really slow or got huge backlogs with applications under full planning permission. Maybe your neighbours are a bit tricky. There's really limited reasons why someone could object to a Class R. And another really useful thing with this is you can use Class R as part of a strategic plan for other development on your farm. So max out your buildings under the Ag PD that Angela's already talked about, and then use Class R to change the use of some of the older buildings. So you end up with a combination of agricultural and non-agricultural uses on the holding, which can be obviously a great way to get some extra income and make the most of your space. It's a relatively quick and easy process, and it doesn't impact directly on agricultural or residential permitted development rights. So what Angela's been talking about earlier and what Hannah's going to come on to later with Class Q. So there's buildings as a start off. Second thing that I'll come on to is temporary uses of land. So this is a really interesting and often little known use of permitted development rights. It doesn't require you to submit anything to the council. There is no process, no application behind this. There is a specification set out in that permitted development order which says that you can use your land for up to 28 days per year for quite a big range of non-agricultural purposes, or any purpose at all, really. There's a few limitations, particularly relating to markets, car boots, or things like that. But this can apply for things like weddings, events, workshops, corporate away days, anything that doesn't involve physical work on land, but that you can do with just the use of it. Restrictions apply. It only applies to land and not buildings. So, for example, if you've got a lovely barn in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a field with just a barn with a nice field around it, and you think, oh, this would lend itself really well to weddings, the field itself you can do under this, and you can put up marquees or TPs, but the building you can't. So you can have it as a backdrop in your photos, but can't actually bring it into the change of use. You can't have it if you're within a listed building or within the curtilage of your garden. So anything within a curtilage of a building, whether that's a house or any other building, doesn't apply under this right. And advertisements aren't permitted either. There are separate restrictions for caravan and camping, which I'll come on to as well. But this is a really useful mechanism for things, again, in the green belt or places where you wouldn't necessarily get planning for other options, or it's really useful as a tool to test something out before then committing to full planning. So 28 days a year, you can get, say, 9 weddings at 3 days a wedding under that if you wanted to test out renting out your land for weddings throughout the year. It's a good starting point, and like I said, no notification to the council. Okay, the last point that I'll come on to is caravans and camping. Now, these have got their own sections within the permitted development legislation, and some of the rules on it are quite strict, but under Part 5, Class A, you can have travelling, or the different restrictions depending on whether you've got more or less than 5 acres. If you've got less than 5 acres of land, you can have 1 caravan at a time for 1 or 2 nights up to 28 days a year. If you've got more than 5 caravans, you can have up to 3. There are exempted organisations out there who can grant you special licences to have more caravans or camping facilities on your site without needing to go through the planning process, and that's also set out within this section of legislation. You can have caravans for seasonal agricultural or forestry workers through this mechanism, and you can also site a caravan while you're doing other building works on the farm through this process. Now, when it comes to camping, a new rule was introduced in 2023, which is Class BC, which is permitted development rights for temporary campsites. And again, this is a really useful mechanism for kind of testing the water or seeing what you can do or whether it works on your land. You can have up to 50 pitches for up to 60 days per calendar year. It is specific to kind of camping and not caravans in this circumstance, and you have to be able to apply toilet and waste disposal facilities as well. There is a prior notification process to tell the council that you're going to do it, giving them specific information, but it's not a prior approval in this case. You're not asking for them to give you permission. That permission is already granted. You're just telling them that this is what you're going to do. It's slightly more complicated if you're in a flood zone or something like that. And again, the exempted organisations can apply to camping. So exempted organisations, somebody like the Freedom Camping, Woodland Champions, even the Caravan and Camping Club, they've got quite significant powers actually to let you do things on your land without needing to go through the planning process. So that's it in a snapshot. We've got use of buildings, use of land, and what you can do for caravans and campings on your farm without needing to go through full planning permission for any of that. And then I think we're moving on to Hannah next to look at some of the residential options.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you, Sally.
Hi everyone, thanks Nick and Ange and Sally. Yeah, so I'm going to talk to you about Class Q, which is another permitted development right. And Class Q allows the change of use and conversion of agricultural building or buildings into residential use. Now, this class of PD has actually been around for nearly 10 years now in various forms. And I'm quite a big fan of Class Q because it gives us opportunity to get permission for residential use and houses in locations which ordinarily we wouldn't get. Class Q conversions can be a little bit Marmite in terms of what they look like. You know, sometimes they're beautiful and sometimes they look like sheds with windows. And so in terms of their design, it can be a bit love it or hate it. But I tend to view Class Q as a stepping stone or a starting point to establishing residential permission in a certain location. And then we can move on and jiggle and poke around a little bit with the design and get something that actually is appropriate or you know, has nicer character in that area. Whether that is still converting the existing shed or possibly even building new build. And I'll come on to that later in the presentation. Nevertheless, Class Q is a big opportunity in terms of getting residential permission. Now, whether that is for yourself to live in, whether that is for kids coming home, whether that's for parents to move into. We've had clients do their Class Qs as holiday lets. We've had people build out Class Qs and use them as rental income. So that's one form of sort of utilising Class Q, but also because in most locations they're worth quite a lot of money, whether that's the plots or the finished houses. So again, we have clients that use that as a way of raising capital from the sale of those assets, and then obviously go on and use that cash to do other things within their farm business. So I'm just going to have a quick run through the types of buildings and some of the criteria that Class Q applies to. So what Class Q does is it grants the change of use and associated building operations for the change of use of the building to residential. In theory, it can be any type of agricultural building so long as it meets the criteria, and I'm going to come on to that a bit more. The starting principle and the most important thing that you have to consider from the start, though, is that the original agricultural building must be structurally sound and it has to be capable of being converted without excessive works. And I am going to talk about that more. There were some new rules introduced in 2024 for Class Q. So all of the rules that I'm talking about today relate to those new ones. And if you haven't looked at Class Q for a few years, there are some fairly chunky changes in that. So the opportunity, what can you do under Class Q? It's quite expansive now. So one of the changes that was made in the 2024 rules is that you can actually now have up to 10 dwellings per agricultural unit and up to a total maximum converted space of 1,000 square metres. Each individual dwelling can only be a maximum of 150 square metres though. So some of those very large ones that we previously were able to get under the old rules, we can't anymore. 150 square metres for reference is a big 3 or a sort of 4 smaller 4-bedroom house. So it's not small, but we're not getting those giant ones that we used to be able to. So what most people do, we rarely, in all honesty, do 10 on a unit. We quite often do anything between 1 and 7 or 8, and in a large single building, just because, you know, quite often it's just a big rectangular building, we would probably be looking at 4 or 5 or maybe 6. In the 2024 new rules, the clock was reset, so it actually brings in quite a lot more agricultural buildings that may not have been previously eligible. So if you are on an established agricultural unit, so what that means, if you're on a working farm, that's not the technical definition, but we can use that in layman's terms. So if you're on an established agricultural unit and there was a building there in place for the 24th of July 2023, so long as that building was approved and then put up through full planning permission and not agricultural PD, then it may now be eligible. If it was put up under PD, then you can't use Class Q until 10 years after it was put up. There are a few complications in terms of if the building was severed from the established agricultural unit since July 2023. The rules are a little bit more complicated around that, so each case needs checking, and we're happy to do that at our initial conversation for you. Similarly, if the building is on an established agricultural unit but not in use for agriculture, for example, if the use had been changed into a workshop or domestic use or maybe even stables or something, it may now also be eligible, whereas it wasn't before. But again, the rules are a little bit complicated and do need checking. So in short, if it is a current agricultural building on an established agricultural unit, it's pretty straightforward. If it either is no longer in agriculture or if it has been separated from the unit, it adds a little bit more complication, and we just have to go through those individually to check whether it's eligible or not. So here's a couple of things that we come up against. One is that people quite often, and totally understandably, don't realise that some parts of the general permitted development order affect each other. So your agricultural permitted development rights that Angela talked about, if you have put up an agricultural shed under PD in the last 10 years, then you don't have Class Q available to you. Those two things affect each other. So if that is the case, ordinarily that would preclude you from utilising your Class Q rights. However, there have been a couple of examples where we've been able to get around that, so it's still potentially just worth giving us a call and seeing if there is something we can do with that. The second thing is that in some instances, when you applied for your agricultural building in the first place through a full application or through a PD, they would have had conditions put on them. It was quite common in the late 1990s in some of our local authorities, for example, Malvern Hills did it very routinely, where they put a condition on an agricultural building to say that it can't be used for anything except agriculture. Now, annoyingly, Class Q doesn't override that condition, so you've got to go and address that condition first. So what I would say is if you've got a shed that you're thinking of looking at, go back and look at the original approval and see if there was any conditions on that, because that can sometimes be a little bit of a deal breaker. So the criteria. The thing about Class Q is that it is very, some elements and some criteria are objective and some are subjective. So the objective ones are really easy for us to work through, and that's the really good thing about Class Q, is that 90% of putting together a Class Q application is yes or no. It's something that we're not, you're never aiming to go into a Class Q application process hoping that you're going to get it. Generally speaking, we should be arriving at the point at which we are pretty convinced we've met all of the criteria, and having put together a good, robust application, you are confident of the outcome. So the objective criteria are that your building, so Class Q doesn't apply if your building is listed, or curtilage listed, a scheduled monument, if it's in a safety hazard area. I'm afraid it also doesn't apply if you're in a national park, national landscape, or AONB, or in a conservation area. These are the things that I've listed which it gets assessed on. So the construction and the operations required for conversion, I've got a separate slide on that shortly. It gets looked at for transport and highways, noise, contamination, flood risk, and suitability of site. And that really relates to, is it next to another shed with 1,000 piglets in it, because it may not be suitable. So again, that one is a little bit subjective. The design considerations that come into Class Q are a bit of a thin line to tread quite often, because really it has to still look like an agricultural building. We need enough windows in it that there is enough natural light, but not too many windows that it is no longer looks like an agricultural building. So you do need somebody experienced, an architect that's an experienced architect to draw up your Class Q, because it is a bit of a balancing act on how you design them. You have to, for example, make sure that your external dimensions don't go beyond 0.2 from the existing building. So you can't have a chimney, you can't have a flue. You know, these are silly little things that you see occasionally in applications, and things are refused for just things like that, which are easily, prevented. the curtilage of a Class Q is tiny, unfortunately. You can't have it any greater than the existing footprint. But again, you can perhaps mess around with that afterwards with a full application, but you've just got to be able to make sure that your Class Q demonstrates that. There are minimum space allowances, and we do have to be able to show that you can get natural light to all habitable rooms. And again, there's a bit of an art to that as well, you know, putting things like bedrooms, kitchens, living spaces on the external walls where you can get your windows, putting things like boot rooms, utility rooms, bathrooms in the centre of buildings where you can't get your natural light to it. So again, experienced architect on Class Qs will know those things. One of the new rules that came in 2024 is that the Class Qs to be eligible must have an existing highway access. So that's something to check. And potentially, if you have to do a planning application for a highway access before you apply for Class Q, that could be possible. So that's just where working with the planning consultant can help sort of give you a head start on that, and you can do things in the right order. And then finally, something that's different to normal planning permission, a Class Q has to be executed and completed within 3 years, so finished and habitable within 3 years, which can make it a bit limited, you know, if you're sort of 2 years in and decide to sell it, or you know, so potentially in those types of situations, we would be looking at changing it to a planning application, so as that you just have to start it within 3 years. Class Q does require prior notification, and I'm afraid on this one it very much feels like a planning application. So it is still a prior notification. We're telling the local authority you're going to execute your exercise your Class Q rights, but the application, because of really the sort of subjective parts of this, which I'm going to come on to, you do just need to be able to you know, give them a really robust, full set suite of planning documents. That means that it sort of you know, our approach is that you're backing the planning officer into a corner, and there is nowhere for them to refuse this. So don't just assume because it's permitted development that you have a light touch on this. This is one where you do have to sort of go for it in terms of making sure you do a good application. So one thing to remember about a Class Q, and this comes back to my original point, that you can use it as a stepping stone. What we quite often do is get the Class Q, and then we go back in to either amend the design for the existing building, or in some cases, we quite regularly now apply to demolish the building and build new. So this is a CGI of an application we're shortly going to submit for a replacement set of buildings to replace existing Class Q application. And in many instances, we can do a significantly better design. We can make it worth more. It's going to be more energy efficient. It's going to look nicer. We can do better parking, better layout, bigger gardens. There's so many reasons to supersede a Class Q with a new application. It's not cheap to do it, but the end product is, in my opinion, in a lot of instances, significantly better than what you can do under the Class Q. But the Class Q allows you to arrive at this point. So it's very much that stepping stone and that important part of the process. The other thing that, of course, doing this allows you to do is that it means that once you've got this planning permission, you only have to start it within 3 years. Don't have to finish it either. So what I'm just going to run through very quickly with you now is one of the most difficult things in Class Qs, and one of the most subjective areas, is that, and I mentioned this at the start, the building has to be capable of conversion, and it has to be substantial and permanent, and that we need to be able to demonstrate to the council that we are truly converting the existing building. So what does that mean? So what I was going to do was just have a quick flip through a few examples of buildings that have been successful for Class Q, because you will see just how varied in construction they are. All of these that I'm about to show you are suitable for Class Q. We can demonstrate that the existing materials can stay, that they are suitable for conversion. Much of the development happens on the inside. So breeze block with fibre cement above it. This one is concrete with timber, and that has actually got steel frame inside. Again, concrete, tin, That one's obviously got a roll top roof. This one was a huge cattle building in Warwickshire, open on one side. As you can see, it's got the feed barriers and stuff, but I think we got 5 or 6 in there. This one is a traditional Dutch barn with just tin on the outside in, can't remember if this is Malvern Hills or Herefordshire. And yeah, I think we got permission for 3 in that building. Another Class Q suitable on that one. So obviously open fronted, old cattle shed. This one is an interesting one. Not a pretty building, but we got permission for that to all be converted into Class Q, and then that was then eventually superseded for something nicer. So that's very much a traditional sort of at cost concrete building. Poultry sheds. Poultry sheds are funny ones though. Many aren't of particularly good construction, so you've got to make sure it's good enough. This was a sort of range of buildings which we did into one very large, again, breeze block, more at costy type of steel frame buildings. So just very quickly, this I would suggest the construction and is it capable of conversion and what building operations need to happen. This is a very high proportion of the issues that happen in Class Q. So this is where you must start and this is where you must get good professional advice, because technically the legislation tells you that you can install walls, roofs, windows, doors and utilities. But case law says that it has to be a conversion, not a rebuild. So in essence, what I'm telling you is that you can't do too much or it won't be considered a conversion. So even though the legislation says you can do all those things, don't say you're going to do all those things because it would be deemed to be a rebuild. So as the way that we work through those points is that we sort of look at it in a procedure of 3 tests. The first thing we do is we establish, is the building permanent, substantial and in good enough structural condition? If yes, what are the building operations that are required for the building to function as a dwelling? And when we're talking about the legislation can install walls, roofs, windows and doors and so on, you only want to be doing some of that. So if it's necessary for you to on, for example, one of those cattle sheds, install a wall and enclose the front, that's probably fine. But what you wouldn't want to be doing is 2 or 3 sides, and you wouldn't want to be doing a whole wall plus the roof, for example. So you just then, that comes on to the 3rd test. When taken as a whole, what are the works required considered to be a conversion? And in practice, what that really means is that the building needs to be relatively well enclosed. 1 open side is probably fine, possibly 1.5. Once you're beyond 50% that needs enclosing, I think that's probably pushing the boundaries. You have to be able to show, and I would want to see that the existing materials need to be reused, can be reused and have longevity. So you'll notice on none of those photos, there was very little timber, really, certainly not timber frame. We struggle with those. Occasionally we can get it, but only where they've been recently built. Certainly things like telegraph poles and things like that won't cut the mustard. And then we show that the actual conversion works really happens inside the building, because anything done internally is not development. So we would, for example, if we went back to that building, for example, what we're showing is the existing building can be kept. I mean, it wouldn't be pretty, but it could be kept. We cut holes in it for the walls, for the windows and the doors. And then on the inside, you put all your insulation. You perhaps might put an internal frame in. And then you can obviously do all your utilities and everything on the inside. So again, what we do is we do something called a conversion method statement, which is where we talk the planner through each element of a building and how it's going to be converted and how we really are still converting it, not rebuilding. So it's a little bit of an art to get Class Qs right. But we are very happy to look at photographs, your own buildings, your own sites. We can mostly do that free of charge. To be honest, we can do that fairly quickly over the phone. So if you've got anything you want us to take a look at and see if we think it's suitable, we're very happy to do that for you. I will hand you back to Nicola.
Thanks, Hannah. I was just going to say, just to put it into context, Class Q is probably one of our strongest areas, isn't? Would you agree? And you know, the national average approval rate sits at sort of 60–65%, and ours sits between 85% and 90%. So it's something we've particularly skilled in. So yes, if people want to send in photos, it's a good idea. Okay, so what we want to do now is just move on to some questions. So if you have any questions, there is a facility on this webinar to ask them. So if you go to the questions tab and submit your question, we should be able to see it here. I'll start off with some that we have had sent in before the webinar. So just Hannah, while you're on a roll with Class Q, you didn't put up any pictures of brickstone buildings there. Is Class Q suitable for brickstone traditional barns?
Yes, it is. You can't use Class Q if the building's listed or curtilage listed. So as long as those brick or stone barns are not listed or curtilage listed, yes, in theory, you can use Class Q. But you can't change the dimensions of anything. So you've got to be able to convert from what's there. So, and obviously sometimes that can be a little bit limited. So, you know, quite often with brick barns, we see that you might need a little link or an addition or an extra bit of space to be able to get in or out or something. So, and in most local authorities, you can use a full application to convert brick or stone barns. So what I would say is that in some instances we don't waste Class Q on brick barns, because sometimes it's better to save that for your steel frame buildings or other things on the farm. But if you don't need it for anything else, then yes, Class Q can be perfectly well used on traditional buildings.
So there you're talking about a full barn conversion planning.
A full planning application. So not using your PD rights, just ask for permission to change the use of those buildings. Great.
Okay. And a question for Angela. Ange, how long do you get to do the work under Ag PD? Just take yourself off mute, if you would. Thank you. Ange, I can't hear you for some reason. Let's come back to it. We'll sort out your mic and come back to it. So a couple of questions coming in. Probably one for you, Sally. Can you briefly talk about off-grid cabins for paying guests and how that works within commercial PD rights?
Yeah, sure. So from a planning perspective, it's not hugely relevant whether it's off-grid or not. It's still a change of use of the land for the siting of a cabin. And if it's paying guests rather than being for family members or just to kind of occasionally stay in connection with your own use of the land, then it pretty much would still require planning permission. So we're looking at that, either looking at needing planning permission for the change of use of land for the siting of cabins for holiday let purposes, or otherwise looking at, realistically, for something like a cabin, you might be looking at one of the site license exemptions. Permitted development in terms of a 28-day route or a short-term thing is probably not going to be ideal for that, where you've kind of got to invest a bit more in the building itself. But there might be options to kind of test the water before getting too far with it.
Okay. Another question's come in. Is there any definition of a building, or is there any guidance or case law references from David? Did that make
Is that specific to a certain type of development or just definition of a building?
It doesn't say, so I'm guessing just in terms of planning law, I suppose.
Yeah, I'm not aware of there being a particular building definition, but interpretation of what building is suitable varies between what you're trying to do with it. So a building that's suitable for Class R might just be a roof on legs. It doesn't necessarily have to have walls, but a building suitable for Class Q, like Hannah said, would need to be much more substantial. Yes. So it's not necessarily, is it a building? It's what fabric is in a kind of part of that structure.
Okay. And another question on Class Q. So this sort of comes down to the strategy that you were talking about, Hannah. If you convert with Class Q, can you then use Class Q again on another site?
So in theory, your Class Q limits, which I described, which is your 1,000 square metres and 10 dwellings, is per agricultural unit. So in theory, if you are farming 2 or 3 farms together as one unit, then that limit applies across those. But with a little bit of forethought and depending on how you present it, and if you have distinctly separate yards, sometimes we can mess around with that a little bit to make it apply to both, and we have done that in the past. If the yards are sort of right next door to each other and all being farmed as one unit, that might be trickier.
Right, okay, thank you. And we have a question here. When searching if a road is classified, does the result simply say classified? How do they know? And how do the results indicate if a road is classified or not? That might make more sense to you than me.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, I can.
Okay.
Yes,
all
right.
So on, for instance, on Find My Street, on the website that I mentioned, that data comes from council highway data generally, and it will be it's set out on a map, and it will usually have a name, a road number, for want of a better word, not like an A road, but a reference number, and that will detail the reference number and what classification that road has.
Okay.
On that website, you can just click on it and it pops up, and it will just tell you in a pop-up whether it's classified or not.
Okay. One for you, Hannah. So could you talk about the constraints when, just bear with me because the question sort of goes off the thing, when submitting a planning application following a successful Class Q? So you've got your Class Q. Is there an opportunity to make minor changes? I know this is, with the changes, this is quite relevant, such as new cladding materials, chimneys, larger windows, or does a full planning application need to demonstrate significant betterment?
So you can if you've got a Class Q, you can change your Class Q under a section. So there's 2 things you can do. You can change your Class Q under a section 73. So you can change the design under a section 73. And on that, you can possibly look at changing things like cladding, moving some windows around. You can do relatively minor changes, but it still has to meet the criteria of Class Q. So you wouldn't, for example, be able to go beyond 0.2 meters from the existing external dimensions. So you can change the design under a section 73, but not make wholesale changes, and it still must meet the criteria of Class Q. If you want to go beyond what would be allowed under Class Q, you have to do that under a full planning application. Now, we've done all sorts. We had one client who still wanted to actually convert his existing frame. He just wanted to, I think it was like a flue. He wanted to change the cladding. There was a bit too much work that would have then not been a Class Q. So he still wanted to convert it. So we then did a full application, but it wasn't loads of changes. It still looked quite similar to what it would have done under the Class Q. We've had it so as that it still very much looks like the original building, but it's just new. It gets demolished and is built new. And then we've had it, which was, for example, the CGI that I showed you, that was originally a steel frame building, and we've totally changed into a whole new look. So wholesale changes of something that looks completely different. So no, you've got to be able to, no, you don't have to show betterment. I think if you're doing a wholesale change, it can help if you do show betterment, and I think that's probably important at that point. But for some of your small minor changes, you don't have to show betterment at that point. I don't know if I've answered that very well, but
No, I think that was absolutely bob on. Yeah. Sally, just coming back to the building question, David said it was regarding the potential for reuse, i.e., is a stone building that has lost its roof still classed as a building?
Good question. If it's lost its roof, if it's still got 4 walls but no roof, then it might be arguable that the majority of the structure is there. But if it doesn't have all of its walls and it doesn't have a roof, then it might have gone too far in construction terms to then be considered something which is a building to reuse. So that is a good question. It's probably more of a specific case to look at rather than having a blanket answer.
Presumably he could repair his roof though, Sal?
Yeah, potentially. Yeah, especially if you've still got an active farm there and there is justification for it under the agricultural PD rights, then you might be able to do works to repair in advance.
Even if it was a you know, fairly basic tin on top or something.
Yeah, potentially.
Okay.
As a general rule, if something is about to fall off or fall down, replace it before it does. Once it's gone, it's a lot harder to do something with. But if you can tell that it's about to go, just replace it like for like straight away, and you have got far fewer problems.
Okay, great. PD rights, you said not for a new business, but can it apply to a business moving to a new site? And also, can you just clarify what classifies as a new business?
So yes, the first point, where an existing business moving to a new site, provided that the background and the backstory can be sort of demonstrated, that and there was some evidence to show to the council that it was an existing business, that should be sufficient to address any concerns that the council have. What was the second part of the question? Sorry, Nick.
The second part was what classifies as a new business? So I guess timescale. Is it timescale? Is it how?
I suppose timescale, scale in itself, and really the history. In principle, a new business on a new site, obviously, clearly, if there's been no agricultural trade or business operating from that particular site, and then something is set up within the last couple of years, last couple of months, in order to achieve planning for agricultural purposes, the council might look quite closely at that. So it's really about getting ducks in a row to organise some information and justification to support an application, and that really is sort of taken in the round. But happy to chat that through if that helps.
Okay, great, thank you. Just a couple. I've got a couple more questions here. I just want to go through. So we are just coming up to the hour, but we'll keep going for a couple of minutes. We always talk about agricultural businesses in terms of the 5 hectares. Do you need 5 hectares of land for Class R and or Class Q? Sal, is that one for you, I think?
Yeah, that's fine. Short answer is no. So the requirement to have 5 hectares or 12.5 acres is specific to the agricultural permitted developments that Angela was talking about. The test under Class R and Class Q is more about whether it's an established agricultural unit, which is a slightly awkward definition, but generally it's about it having been a functional working farm in some circumstances for a period of 10 years at some point. Linked to the answer that Angela was giving previously about the kind of what is a working farm, the kind of evidence that councils will look for to proof there has been a trade or business. You might be looking at evidence of invoicing. If you've got farm accounts, then being able to show those, evidence of there being records, even if not invoicing, but records of sales and purchases and things like that, or registrations with the RPA, business name registrations with Company House, those kind of things. So established agricultural unit, but not necessarily 5 hectares.
Okay, thank you. We have a polytunnel question. So I have been building my flower farming business, originally planned to be on a field I was renting. But I now own the land plus 2 adjacent blocks of a total of 17 acres. I realised I had sunk the post prior to realising I needed PD, so stopped and submitted the information. I can show the business has been running. Can they refuse? If they refuse, can I appeal? So they're visiting the site. If they refuse, can they appeal? Maybe just a quick summary of polytunnels and permission for those.
Do you want me to dive in there, Andrew? Do you want to carry
Yes,
on?
please.
Yes, please.
Yeah, no, that's fine. So polytunnels are generally treated in the same way as buildings in agricultural PD purposes. So there is a little bit of a definition or distinction between whether it's the kind of polytunnel that is a permanent structure that's up all year with a roof on it, or whether it's something more like a cover where you've got poles and a cover is put on and off seasonally. But it's still, to be able to qualify for your agricultural PD rights, you've got to prove that it's reasonably necessary for the purposes of agriculture or horticulture on that holding. I'm not sure from what you described there, Nick, whether it was the works have been started and then the council are coming out to look at it. If that's the case, then your agricultural permitted development rights don't apply because it has to be a prior notification before you do anything.
Right. Yes.
So the options there are you look at retrospective planning permission, or depending on how much work you've done, you take it down again and then go back to the drawing board.
Right.
There is option to appeal, but it obviously depends what reason the council gives for refusing something as to whether that's something that can be overcome.
Yeah, so the lady said she'd sunk the post prior to realising she needed the prior notification. So it
might be
simpler to take them out and start again. Yeah.
Possibly.
Okay, great. So let's move on and just there's a few more questions there, but we are very happy to go back to you individually. So I'll have a look at that after the webinar is finished. So if we just finish off here, so how can we help you? Obviously, if you have a planning project and you would like some help, if you call or email the business, then we can offer you a free initial chat. So we have 4 planning consultants who can talk to you. And we're quite happy to have the initial look at your project and have an initial chat with you. This is the lady you normally speak to first. So this is Jess, who is our customer service advisor, and she will point you to the planning consultant that's best suited to the project that you're looking at. Give us a call on this number, email us, but also please do look at our YouTube, subscribe to our YouTube site. So that is the Rural Planning Co. And our social media. It's actually, we put up some really useful stuff and some really useful resources alongside our website. So please do have a look at those. So just to say thank you very much for joining us. We will come back to you if we haven't managed to answer one of your questions, but thank you very much for joining us, and we hope you've found it useful. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.